In this video, we're putting 3 budget-friendly 10 gig switches head-to-head and finding out which one actually deserves a spot in your rack or on your desk. We've got the SODOLA 12-port 10G hybrid switch, the fanless SODOLA 8-port 10G L3 SFP Plus switch, and the TRENDnet TL2 F7080 8-port 10G SFP Plus switch. I'm going to focus on the 3 things that matter most in a real home lab or small office: noise, power draw, and real-world transfer performance. By the end, you'll know exactly which one fits your set. Quick note before we dive in, this video isn't sponsored by any of these brands. I bought these switches myself so I can be honest about the good and the bad. If you find this helpful, hit like, subscribe, and drop your own results in the comments so we can build up some real-world data on these boxes. For the unboxing, both the SODOLA switches comes with some quick start user manual, rack mount ears, and some rubber feet. The 8-port SODOLA switch also has a serial cable included. The 12-port SODOLA switch has an integrated power supply, so it only came with a power cable. The TRENDnet came with a power brick, serial cable, and server rack ears. All of the switches are packed snugly in their respective boxes to protect them from damage. Let's talk about how I actually tested these, because noise, power, and throughput numbers are pretty meaningless without some real context behind them. For all 3 switches, I used the exact same test setup. That means a 10G capable PC with an NVMe SSD and a PCIe 10 Gigabit NIC, plus a 10G NAS for point-to-point tests. I used a couple of SFP Plus DAC cables for all the links. For traffic generation and measurement, I did large sequential file copies in the 750 gigabyte range to see real-world transfer speeds and catch any weird dips or stalls. I also tested jumbo frames wherever they were supported, but I'll keep the commentary understandable without disappearing too far into MTU nerdland. For power, everything was measured at the wall using a plug-in meter. For each switch, I logged 3 scenarios: idle with no links up, idle with a single 10G link up, idle with 2 10G link up, and then the large file transfer test. Noise was measured using a simple phone dB meter app at 1 meter in front of the switch, in a quiet room with a baseline in the low 30 dBA range. I captured 3 key points: cold start or boot noise, idle noise after a few minutes of settling, and sustained load while the switch was routing or switching a bunch of 10G traffic. When you look at the SFP Plus slots on these switches, you've basically got 2 main ways to light them up at 10 gig, SFP Plus DAC cables and SFP Plus fiber modules. There's also the base T modules, but that has the most latency and consume the most power, so I try to avoid it whenever possible. Let's start with SFP Plus DAC, or direct attach copper. This is a single fixed cable with SFP Plus ends on both sides, and inside it's just high-quality copper twin-ax. That means it's cheap, uses very little power, and is essentially plug-and-play. The trade-off is distance. DAC is really meant for short runs inside a rack or between 2 nearby racks, typically up to about 3 to 5 meters for passive cables, and around 7 to 10 meters if you go active. It's perfect for connecting your switch straight to a NAS, a server, or another switch that's sitting right next to it. SFP Plus fiber modules work a bit differently. They come in 2 parts: the SFP Plus transceiver you plug into the switch, and a separate fiber patch cable between them. They cost more, and each transceiver draws a bit more power than a DAC, but in exchange you get much longer reach, tens of meters on multi-mode fiber, and even kilometers on single mode. Fiber is what you use when you need to go across the room, across floors, or out to another building, and you also get excellent signal integrity and very low latency. Functionally, both options just show up to the switch as a standard 10G SFP Plus port, so switches like the SODOLA units or the TRENDnet will happily take either. The rule of thumb is simple: use DAC for short, cheap, low-power links inside the rack. Use SFP Plus fiber modules when you need distance or more flexible physical routing. A quick note on taking these modules out of the switches: make sure you use the lever switch or pull ribbon to release it from the switch, or you will damage it and/or the switch. Let's start with the loud one, because this is important if you care about noise. The TRENDnet 8 port has an internal fan. It's simply too noisy for a living room or an office. In my testing, the behavior was pretty consistent. On power up, the fan spins up hard and is clearly audible in a quiet room. Once it's idling, the tone settles down a bit, but you still hear a constant whir in the background. Under load, the fan ramps up again. It's not jet engine loud, but it absolutely feels like network closet gear, not sit right next to your monitor gear. Subjectively, the pitch is on the higher side, and people online have noticed that the fan tends to ramp up and down, which is actually more annoying than a steady hum. The 8-port SODOLA is honestly bliss to live with. There are no fans at all. With the switch powered on, even with all the SFP Plus ports lit up and pushing traffic, there's still no mechanical noise. Any sound you think you're hearing in the room is almost certainly coming from your other gear, not this switch. So if you've got a home lab that lives in your office or bedroom, or you're building a silent editing bay, this box is a huge win. The 12-port SODOLA, on the other hand, sits somewhere in the middle. It has a single smart fan, and on paper it's rated at up to about 35 dBA. In my testing, the behavior was pretty straightforward. On boot, you hear the fan spin up, but it settles down fairly quickly. At idle, with only a couple of links active, it's an audible low hum, but it's noticeably quieter and lower pitched than the TRENDnet 8-port. Under heavier load, the fan does ramp up, but it never reaches screaming data center levels. It's more like a small desktop switch sitting in a quiet rack. For a small office or a home lab rack that isn't in your bedroom, this noise level is perfectly acceptable. But if you need absolute silence, the SODOLA 8-port is the only one of these 3 that truly disappears acoustically. Next up is power draw. These switches are often running 24/7, so even a few watts of difference will quietly add up over the course of a year. SODOLA's own spec lists the board power consumption at around 45.8 watts max. That figure covers the switch itself, plus some overhead for whatever optics or copper modules you plug in. In my measurements, it behaved pretty much how you'd expect for a 12-port hybrid 10G box. Idle with no cables connected, it sits comfortably below that max value. Every active 10G base T port adds a noticeable chunk of power because 10G copper fists are genuinely hungry. Once you populate all of the 10G base T ports and light up several SFP Plus ports, you creep up toward that spec number. If you're running this fully loaded, 24/7, you do need to budget for it in terms of both power and heat. It's still far more efficient than a big enterprise chassis, but it is the hungriest of the three by design. The 8-port SFP Plus L3 switch is much more modest. There's no published max wattage in the documentation I saw, but fanless SFP Plus switches in this class typically sit in the teens to low 20s of watts under normal load, depending on which optics or DAC cables you're using. In my testing, it lined up with that expectation. Idle with no links up, it was the lowest power draw of all three switches. With several DAC cables lit and real traffic moving, the draw did climb, but it still stayed clearly below the 12-port hybrid. So if you really care about power efficiency, especially for a home lab that's on 24/7, this one is very gentle on your power bill. TRENDnet actually gives us a clear spec here, 23.53 watts maximum consumption. On my meter, the real-world behavior was pretty reasonable. Idle with no links, it was just over half of the SODOLA 12 ports idle draw. With a few SFP Plus links lit and pushing traffic, it climbed, but stayed comfortably in line with its rated spec. So power-wise, the TRENDnet lands right in the middle. It's hungrier than the fanless SODOLA 8-port, but noticeably more efficient than the 12-port hybrid, which has extra ports and a beefier board to feed. Now for the fun part. Can these cheap boxes actually move 10 gig traffic in all its glory? Using an SMB transfer between a 10G PC and an Unraid 10G NAS, each switch was able to push roughly 400 to 500 megabytes per second on a single stream, assuming you've got good NICs, proper cables, and you've set up jumbo frames and offloads reasonably well. On screen, I'll show you the exact graphs for each switch, but the short version is there were no surprise losers in basic single-link testing. However, the speed difference between the actively cooled switches and the passively cooled one is pretty obvious here. If you do large sustained transfers on the passively cooled 8-port SODOLA, the speed will eventually drop off as it heats up. So after all that, here's how I'd actually choose between these three in the real world. Pick the SODOLA 12-port hybrid if you specifically need a mix of 10G base T and SFP Plus in a single box. You want lots of 10G ports for the money? 12 ports at this price is very hard to beat. The switch is going in a network closet, garage, or rack, where fan noise is not a problem. And you're comfortable dealing with a more basic OEM-style web UI and fairly limited vendor support. Pick the SODOLA 8-port 10G L3 fanless if you need your switch to be absolutely silent and live right next to you. On a desk, in a bedroom, in an editing suite. Inter-VLAN routing, a built-in DHCP server, even RIP and OSPF if you're experimenting with dynamic routing. Your environment is mostly SFP Plus fiber or direct attach cable, and you're okay buying a few SFP Plus to RJ45 modules to handle copper devices. You're a home labber or network nerd who will actually use those advanced features and doesn't mind a steeper learning curve in the UI. Pick the TRENDnet TL2 F7080. If you want a brand name, business-grade switch with proper documentation, firmware, and support, you need robust L2 Plus features, VLANs, MSTP, QoS, multicast, ACLs, 802.1x, plus simple static routing between VLANs for basic inter-VLAN routing. You're okay with SFP Plus only uplinks and a modest amount of fan noise in operation. And this is going in a small business, school, lab, or serious home lab where reliability and that lifetime warranty matter more than squeezing every last experimental feature out of the silicon. If you're curious on which switch I picked, then it's the 12-port SODOLA for my office. The noise doesn't bother me, and the sustained transfer speed really does help my workflow. I also kept the 8-port SODOLA for my bedroom just for those occasional gaming sessions. I am extremely surprised that these SODOLA performed so well for the price. Honestly, I have never heard of this brand before, and I bought them to see how they perform. I originally was only going to keep the TRENDnet one, so that should tell you how much they impressed me. If you are on the fence and in a similar situation, I highly recommend these SODOLA ones. Thanks for sticking around through this three-way 10G showdown. If you're about to build or upgrade a home lab, a quiet 10G editing rig, or a small office core, I hope this helped you narrow down which switch will actually work for you day to day, not just on a spec sheet. Drop your own noise, power, and throughput numbers in the comments if you've got any of these switches, especially if you're running them in unusual setups. Hit like if this was useful, subscribe if you want more deep dive networking and home lab content, and I'll see you in the next one.